Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, the online evolution magazine. And I am here with David Geary and Gabrielle Principe. Gabrielle is the education editor for This View of Life, and David is one of the co-organizers of a Evolution Institute workshop titled Evolutionary Perspectives on Educational Research, Policy, and Practice. So welcome, David.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
And so tell us a little bit about the whole workshop, and then we could proceed to your talk. You gave the first talk.
Sure. Well, Dan approached me about organizing this workshop.
That was Daniel Birch, who will be interviewing later.
Right. Yeah. Dan Birch approached me about submitting a conference grant to the American Educational Research Association on evolution in education. And I said, well, sure, I'll be happy to do that, thinking there's no way the AERA will ever fund this. I went to one of their conferences once, and there was very little interest in evolution in education. But I was very surprised to find and pleased that they did fund it, and allowed us to bring a number of people together to discuss issues related to how the evolved mind can learn culturally novel, evolutionarily novel abilities.
And you've been a pioneer in this area, so maybe you could give us a little bit of historical perspective as to why this is so new.
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I started thinking about it probably mid-90s or maybe a little earlier than that, based on my experience with my daughter and what she was getting in essentially math classes in elementary school, but also because of the prominence of whole language at that point, and the notion that learning to read was somehow continuous with language learning. And I knew there was something wrong with that idea. One, empirically it didn't work, but I struggled with exactly, what is the difference there. And I had been kind of tutoring myself and getting readings from anthropologists on, getting up speed on evolution. And so I was thinking about that at the same time. And actually happened to sit in a talk by Al Lieberman, who did a lot of work on the phonetic system and language system and so forth. And he just made an offhand comment about reading being kind of secondary. And that kind of the light bulb went off. So, okay, right, that's right. That's the difference between reading and language. One is an evolved where there's plasticity in there, but kids will naturally learn it when immersed in a kind of a natural social environment. But reading is a much more evolutionarily recent sorts of thing. It's a cultural invention, occurred a few times. And kids, we know, just don't learn it, at least the majority of them don't learn it, without some explicit instruction on phonetic decoding and later for comprehension and organizing how you're reading text and so forth. And that got me thinking about making a distinction between primary and secondary. And they're categorical. I mean, I'm sure there's overlap.
Well, let's focus on that, because that is a key distinction, foundational. So, so what is the distinction between primary and secondary learning?
So, primary is learning that it would be universal. It would involve evolved cognitive competencies, language, reading facial expressions, learning to deal with people, all involved in kind of a folk psychology, learning to deal with other species in the ecology in which you live, predator, prey, plants that you're going to eat later on, so forth, learning to navigate, a number of skills that we call folk biology and folk physics. And they're very complex skills, and people live in different social environments and different ecologies, and so we'd expect these systems to be plastic, and there'd be kind of a point in a time period when kids learn and adapt or fine-tune these systems to their local conditions, and so they're not identical, but the basic structure is identical across human groups. But then if we look at something like reading, writing, arithmetic, other types of school-taught things, they're not universal at all, and they're only found in cultures where they're explicitly taught to kids. And they're taught to kids because they're important for being successful in that culture in adulthood. And so I thought when I first wrote about primary and secondary, I did it in math, and I thought it was important to make a kind of a clear distinction between them to make the basic point that learning algebra is very remote from our intuitive sense of magnitude, but having some instruction in that will pay dividends for the rest of your life in a number of different contexts. And it's not something that we should expect kids to be inherently motivated to learn. It's not something we should expect them to find easy to learn, but it is in their long-term benefit to do so.
I'd like to hear you talk about some of the empirical work that you shared at the meeting today.
Right. So what I talked about was an ongoing, or actually just starting in about its third year longitudinal study. We're going to study a bunch of preschool kids in federal Title I program. So these are kids considered at risk because they have low academic achievement or pre-literacy skills, or their parents are in an at-risk category. We're going to follow these kids through 2 years of preschool, kindergarten, and then through first grade. And in first grade, we've already identified, due to other work we've done, the early number knowledge, secondary knowledge of early mathematics that's going to predict their long-term trajectory in mathematics, controlling for IQ and working memory and other sorts of things. And so what we want to do is step it back 3 or 4 years and say, okay, what do kids need to know, when they're 3 years of age in order to be successful when they enter first grade? So that's the practical goal of it. The evolutionary goal of it is saying, well, are these kind of secondary symbolic skills, like understanding Arabic numerals and the quantities they represent, or number words and the quantities they represent, are these bootstrapped, this initial learning bootstrapped onto a primary kind of evolved sense of magnitude, which some people call a number sense. And so we're empirically looking at that relationship, saying, okay, if that is true, if kids use their early number sense to scaffold their learning of these secondary types of things, then we should find a relation between, the acuity of their inherent system and ease of learning. And that's what we're finding, that learning the initial symbols, having a good inherent base is important. And I should say that this inherent base, even though it's inherent, it appears to be malleable. So you can improve it. You can increase the fidelity of the system. But it also looks like once they get the basics of numerals, number words, and cardinality, kind of the magnitudes they represent, that mathematics achievement is related to the acquisition of these secondary symbol systems and not the inherent system. So the inherent system kickstarts the process. And then once it gets going, it appears as if it kind of moves on its own. We'll know that better as we recruit more kids into the study and as we have longer term data.
Well, I want to know, does secondary knowledge begin with such things as writing and math, or do other cultures, including cultures without writing and math, have secondary knowledge of their own?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would assume that some specific tools, or however they build shelters or other types of things, there's going to be variability there, that there may be some learning or a lot of trial and error types of things if there's no explicit.
And tracking was mentioned in another talk as a form of, maybe a form of secondary knowledge that requires much practice and so on and so forth. Do you think tracking would count as a form of secondary knowledge?
No, I would include tracking and navigation and stuff as a primary type of thing. We see pretty good navigational skills on lots of different species. They may use different types of strategies to get from one place or another. And so I think tracking in a lot of these traditional societies is, it's built on the hippocampus and some parietal systems for, mapping, far space and stuff. It's in my mind, and the works I've done, it's a primary system.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'd like to hear a bit about your thoughts on whether your findings or your ideas, what sorts of implications they might have for education, curriculum, or specifically for pedagogy with children.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for the preschool years, the early years, it implies kind of a mix of instruction, but couched in play and more natural activities, because I think the line between a primary and a secondary, kind of knowing and recognizing magnitude and associating that with Arabic numerals, it's a gray area. They're overlapping to some extent, and so I think during the preschool years you've got more of a play, but with some specific goals in mind in terms of, for mathematics, understanding numerals, number words, cardinal value, a relative magnitude of numerals are absolutely critical in terms of being prepared for formal mathematics, at least in this country. But I think once you move into more formal settings, then I think the implications are that the structure, organization of learning of what needs to be learned is probably going to have to be provided by the teacher, the curriculum, or whatever, because there's no built-in structure to learn algebra. Whatever foundation is there is what's been taught prior to that. So I think it speaks to the importance for a number of kids for direct, explicit instruction rather than a discovery approach.
So let me ask the final question, and we're going to ask this for all of the participants. What is the added value of approaching education from an evolutionary perspective?
Right. So if we had taken this approach, kind of the difference between a primary and a secondary ability, for example, the difference between language and reading, for example, we never would have had whole language in this country. And we wouldn't have had millions of adolescents and adults who are now very poor readers as a result of just being essentially left on their own to try to figure it out on their own. Some kids can, but many of them can't. So in my opinion, that was a disaster. It was an educational fad, an attempt to try something new without any consequences for the people who developed it, with very severe consequences for many other people who were subjected to it.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much, and this was great.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.